Maria, would you mind just typing yes into the chat box if you can hear me? Thank you, Giles. Thank you, Maria. Thank you, Colette. Okay, so welcome to the presentation. It's split into four general sections, although really it's more in two kind of big halves. The first half is looking into some of the background theory and research that's been done into memorization and how it can be applied in the classroom. And the second part is looking into what we can actually do as teachers every day. Now, given that a lot of people have opted in to attend a session on memory, then I make an assumption right at the beginning that most people have bought into the idea that memory is a good thing, that we are able to remember the things that we learn in school. Um, However, for some reason, when I think about the kinds of training I went through when I became a teacher, and when I think about the kinds of training that I continue to go through, usually as part of typical CPD, and also when I hear a lot of the rhetoric and the debate and the discussion that's happening in the wider educational space, I find that typically memorization or the idea of memory is either not mentioned at all, certainly never given as a priority, and that's almost at best. At worst, sometimes there's almost a fear of memorization. You hear people talk about the idea of a pub quiz curriculum, or the idea of having kids drilled with dry, rote, meaningless facts which they can regurgitate but not really understand. Obviously, there isn't a person alive who thinks that that is a good thing, and it's certainly not what I'm going to advocate. And there's a strange almost sort of paradox there, where that kind of discussion is being said, and yet at the same time, people often lament the fact that kids in school struggle to retain the things that we teach them, things that sometimes even they seem to understand perfectly. One thing that I should add is that I found when I deliver this kind of presentation live, in the sense that I would be in front of a live audience and we can see each other and we can interact as we would normally, I find that the ideas tend to spark a great deal of questions and thoughts in people's minds, especially as they try to relate it to what they already know about teaching and their experience so far. Our setup here is obviously a little bit different because we're interacting remotely, but it would be great if we could retain as much of that as possible, because I think that people tend to get the most out of the discussion almost more than anything else, thinking about the ideas and thinking about how they apply to their experience and what they've seen kids do day to day, their failures and their successes. So by all means, if you do have any questions at any point or any things that you'd like to raise, please do use the chat box, and hopefully we can talk about those as we continue. For my part, thinking about why this is something of something that is important to me and something that I think about, there were two quotes that have stuck with me over the past few years. This is the first one. The aim of all instruction is to alter long-term memory. If nothing has changed in long-term memory, nothing has been learned. I read this from a piece of research published by three academics, Kirshner, Sweller, and Clark. And what really stood out for me when I read this is, in my initial teacher training, there'd been so many conversations, so many talks, workshops, seminars that had begun with the question, what is the point of education? What is the point of learning? What is the point of teaching? What is the goal of teaching? And so forth. And typically, we were never given any answer to that by our instructors. We were typically asked to just discuss it or debate it. And the kinds of answers people came up with were things like to promote a lifelong love of learning, to make people independent learners, to develop critical thinking skills, to develop problem solving skills, to get people ready to become democratic citizens, to transmit culture is one that I haven't heard as often, but I find interesting. And another one would be to prepare people for the world of work. It's not so much that I think any one of those is incorrect. I think, in fact, if anything, what made those discussions so useless to me, uh, they didn't really have any utility for me because they didn't offer me any idea as to what it was I needed to do day to day. I think it's great to have those discussions. I think it's great that we keep those long-term objectives and at the forefront of our mind, and we're always going back to them and wondering, is what I'm doing day to day ultimately feeding into that? But none of those objectives answered the question of what I need to do as a teacher day to day in the classroom. This quote really stood out for me because it had or brought with it an incredible sense of clarity, which has stuck with me ever since. The aim of all instruction is to alter long-term memory. So now, when I think about what it is that I'm going to do in the classroom, I'm thinking, what is it that I want the kids to know? And what is it about that I want them to know? That almost kind of meta level of understanding. Or what is it that I want them to be able to do? If we're thinking about mathematics in particular, then there's obviously a great deal of procedural knowledge which we teach, the typical mathematical processes and algorithms that we want pupils to be familiar with and to be able to use. So now I see a, a big chunk of what I do as being making sure that they understand that and then that they're going to retain it day after day after day into the months, into the years, which runs in stark contrast to my second quote. This quote came from a girl in year 10. This girl she had been in my form, and it wasn't me who taught her when she said this. She was being taught by somebody else, but he sort of retold the anecdote to the rest of the department. She'd said, "What's the point of learning this?" And straight away you think, right, we know where this is going. We hear this conversation all the time. So what's the point of learning this? When am I ever going to need to use this? And so it surprised me what she said next. Next week, we're just going to move on to something else, and we're going to forget everything anyway. Now, this particular girl that I have in mind, I don't want to go into too much detail about who she is, but I'm sure you have some one, if not many, people very much like her in your own schools. She is somebody who, should we say, is a classic underachiever. She's somebody who, placed in the right environment, probably could be extremely successful and would do very well. And yet, in this environment, she was somebody who was definitely underachieving. Yeah, she was very capable, could be highly successful. Instead, she was struggling around the CD borderline. And so I found it very interesting that she said this because the previous year when she was in year 9, I did used to teach her for one lesson per week. And during one of these lessons, we were looking at how to solve equations. And she was very good at it, all the way up to sort of basic two-step equations you'd find on the foundation paper. I sat and watched her, barely teaching her anything, and she could do 2,000 of them, and she was happy to sit there and just do one after the other, because she was experiencing a great deal of success, and she had that nailed completely. And then this one year on, when we were in year 10, I was helping her with the foundation papers, part of a revision group. She put her hand up, "Sir, how do I do this?" And it was one of those very basic equations I'd seen her solve so many of that one time in year 9. And I said to her, "But you know how to do this. This time last year, I watched you do so many of these perfectly." And she just looked at me and said, "Did I?" She couldn't even remember that there was a time when she was able to do this, never mind how to do it. So, I guess we have a question here. In that lesson, if we assessed her at the end of the lesson, would we say that she had learned? Would we say that she had been successful? I think so. Learning objective, be able to solve two-step equations. She clearly had that down. And yet here we are 1 year later, she can't even remember the time when she could do it. So did she really ever learn it? Really? I mean, that's a debate that can go on at length, but just so you understand where I'm coming from, I think it's absolutely critical. I think a part of what we do as teachers and a part of what we need to do every day as teachers is not merely to help people to understand something in the moment, but to make sure that everything we're doing is geared around ensuring that they retain it the next week, the next month, and the next year. And that's what I've been pouring a lot of time and energy into over the past year or two, and doing a lot of reading around, looking into the research into memory. So that is why I think that memory is so important. I think it's why I think it's important that we keep it at the forefront of our minds, and why I don't think it's something that we need to be afraid of. If you can't remember anything, you're certainly not going to have any form of deeper understanding. So I think it's important that we look first at some of the theories of memory. How is it that our memory structure actually works? Because until we understand that, we're not going to have a very powerful idea of what it is we can do in the classroom and why it is that those things will work and will be effective. This quote is gaining more and more um, awareness now. People are increasingly aware of this idea. Memory is the residue of thought, that particular quote. It comes from one particular book and it comes from one particular cognitive psychologist. I'm just curious to understand where people are at the moment. Has anybody heard of that before? If you have, could you just type yes into the chat box? And if you haven't, please could you type no?